Read me the headline one more time. Iran seized 2 ships, the MSC Francesca, the Epaminondas. 31 Western vessels turned back from the blockade, oil at $100 a barrel. And China said nothing. Every anchor, every correspondent, every think tank fellow went on television and explained the ship seizures. The tonnage, the flags, the cargo manifest, the legal justification Iran gave, the outrage from the shipping companies, the insurance implications, the route diversions. Covered everything except the one thing that actually matters. China's silence. And I want to tell you something about that silence before we go any further. Silence from China is never an accident. China has the most sophisticated foreign policy communication apparatus on the planet. When Beijing wants to signal displeasure, it summons ambassadors. When Beijing wants to signal support, it issues statements. When Beijing wants to signal that something historic is happening and it does not want Washington to understand what Beijing understands about that historic thing, China goes quiet. And right now, on the most significant maritime event since the Suez crisis, China is completely, deliberately, strategically quiet. That silence is not confusion. That silence is not caution. That silence is China watching something it has been waiting a decade to see and making absolutely sure it does not say anything that would cause Washington to understand what China understands. I want to take you through exactly what China sees when it looks at those 2 seized ships. Because what China sees is not a provocation. What China sees is not an escalation. What China sees is a proof of concept. And a proof of concept, once demonstrated, changes the architecture of the world permanently. Start with what actually happened because the details matter more than the headline. The MSC Francesca is a container vessel. Mediterranean shipping company, the largest container shipping line on earth. The Epaminondas is a bulk carrier, both flying flags that Iran considers operating under American commercial or financial frameworks. Both seized in the Strait of Hormuz, the waterway through which roughly 20% of the world's oil passes every single day, 40% of all seaborne oil. 17 million barrels a day at minimum. Iran did not seize these ships randomly. Iran did not seize them because of the specific cargo. Iran seized them because of what they represent. The MSC Francesca represents the Western commercial shipping architect, the global container system that moves everything from electronics to medicine to grain to consumer goods across the planet. The system that is denominated in dollars, cleared through SPOFT, insured through Lloyd's of London, tracked by American satellite networks, and ultimately protected by the assumption that the United States Navy guarantees freedom of navigation. Iran just put that assumption in custody, and China watched it happen and said nothing. Now let me tell you what was happening at exactly the same moment those 2 ships were being seized, because this is the part that every outlet missed. Russia's foreign minister Lavrov was on the phone with Iran's foreign minister Araghchi. And at the end of that call, Russia's foreign ministry published a readout. I want you to read one sentence from that readout very carefully. Iran reaffirmed its readiness to allow the unimpeded transit of Russian vessels through the Strait of Hormuz. Not all vessels, Russian vessels. While the Hormuz Strait remains, in Iran's exact framing, not possible to reopen for America. While 31 Western ships have been turned back. While the MSC Francesca and the Epaminondas sit in Iranian custody. Iran gave Russia safe passage in the same 48-hour window that it was seizing Western ships. That is not a coincidence. That is a system. And China has seen this system before. China has studied this system. China built its entire strategic posture for the last decade specifically to be inside this system when it went operational. The ship seizures are the headline. The Russia guarantee is the mechanism. China's silence is the signal that the mechanism is working exactly as designed. I call the framework, I want to take you through the proof of concept moment. And understanding why those 2 specific ships seized at this specific moment, while Russia gets a specific bilateral guarantee, while China says absolutely nothing, tells you what the something big actually is. Because the something big is not about those 2 ships. It never was. The something big is about whether the system that has governed global maritime commerce for 70 years, the system of American guaranteed freedom of navigation, can be replaced by a different system. A system where passage is sorted by political alignment. And the answer Iran just demonstrated in the most visible way possible by seizing the flagship vessels of Western commercial shipping while guaranteeing Russian transit in the same news cycle is, yes, that system can be replaced. Iran just showed the proof. And China, which has been building toward this proof of concept for a decade, went completely silent because China does not want Washington to understand what Beijing just confirmed. Let me build the historical framework because this is where the depth of what China understands becomes visible. China studies maritime history more carefully than any other major power on earth. China's entire strategic doctrine for the last 20 years has been built around one specific vulnerability that Chinese strategists call the Malacca dilemma. The fact that China's energy supply, the oil that runs its factories, and its military and its economy passes through maritime choke points that a hostile power could theoretically block. China has spent 20 years building around that vulnerability. The strategic petroleum reserve now holding over 1 billion barrels. The dark fleet of tankers that moves Iranian and Russian crude outside Western tracking systems. The UN payment architecture that routes oil purchases outside SPOFT, the Beidou satellite network that gives China independent maritime tracking. Every single one of those investments was made in anticipation of a moment when the Western maritime system and an alternative system would diverge. And China needed to be positioned on the right side of that divergence before the divergence happened. The 2 seized ships tell China that the divergence has begun. The Russia guarantee tells China which side of it Beijing is on. The silence tells you that China knew this was coming and prepared for it. The historical parallel China is running right now is 1956 Suez. Not because the geography is similar, although it is. Not because the geopolitics rhyme, although they do. but because 1956 Suez is the clearest example in modern history of what happens when a country permanently asserts sovereign operational authority over a maritime choke point that Western powers had treated as effectively international waters. In 1956, Egypt's President Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. He began sorting ships. Some passed with Egyptian coordination requirements and Egyptian tolls. Some were denied passage. Britain and France looked at that sorting system and called it a bargaining chip, temporary leverage before Egypt returned to normal international maritime practice. They were so convinced it was temporary that Britain and France, along with Israel, launched a military operation to take the canal back. And they lost. Not militarily, they won militarily. They lost politically, economically, diplomatically, and historically. Because Eisenhower told them to stop, and they stopped. And the world accepted that Egypt controlled Suez on Egyptian terms, and Suez has operated on Egyptian terms ever since. 70 years, the canal that Britain and France went to war to keep international has been Egyptian sovereign territory for 70 years, because Nasser established in practice, one ship at a time, one coordination requirement at a time, that Egypt was the competent authority for passage. Iran is doing the Nasser move, and China is watching it happen with the calm of a country that has already decided which side of the Suez moment it wants to be on. There is a second historical parallel China is running simultaneously, and this one is darker and more complicated, and I want to be careful about how I frame it because the parallel is instructive without being deterministic. In 1941, the United States imposed a total oil embargo on Japan. Japan, at that moment, was dependent on American oil for roughly 80% of its military fuel. The American strategic calculation was precise. Cut off the resource, Japan cannot sustain military operations. Japan comes to the negotiating table and America extracts the concessions it wants. For several months, Tokyo appeared to be negotiating. American officials believed the deal was possible. During that entire period, Japan was quietly sorting its own maritime relationships. Japanese vessels moved through waters Japan controlled. American commercial access was increasingly restricted. The sorting was gradual, a coordination protocol here, and an inspection requirement there. A harbor access rule revised quietly in one direction. By the time the sorting system was fully operational, Japan had already concluded that what came next was not going to involve American cooperation at any level. Now, I want to be precise about what this parallel is and what it is not. Iran is not Japan. The situations are not identical. Iran is not preparing a surprise military strike on American naval infrastructure. But the lesson China draws from the Japan parallel is not about military outcomes. The lesson China draws is about what happens when a country under maximum economic pressure begins sorting maritime relationships by political alignment, and the dominant power misreads that sorting as negotiating behavior rather than structural realignment. America in 1941 looked at Japan's diplomatic activity and saw negotiation. It was not negotiation, it was preparation. America today is looking at Iran's ship seizures and seeing leverage in a negotiation. China is watching those seizures and seeing something structurally different. China is seeing a country that has already decided what the new system looks like and is establishing it in practice while diplomacy provides the cover. And here is what makes China's silence so precisely calibrated and so important. China has 7.7 million barrels of Iranian crude heading to its refineries right now, moving through the Strait of Hormuz, moving through the same waterway where the MSC Francesca and the Epaminondas sit in custody. China's tankers are not being seized. China's tankers are not being turned back. China is on the safe passage list. And China built itself onto that safe passage list not last month, not last year, but over an entire decade of patient strategic investment. The yuan oil payment agreements with Iran that began in 2012. The Belt and Road port infrastructure that gave Iran an alternative to Western financial systems. The diplomatic protection China provided Iran in the UN Security Council every time America pushed for additional sanctions. The teapot refineries in Shandong province that processed sanctioned Iranian crude outside the Western integrated refining system. China did not get on Iran's safe passage list by accident. China got onto that list by making itself indispensable to Iran's economic survival before the moment of maximum pressure arrived. And now that the moment of maximum pressure has arrived, China is on the safe passage list. Its crude is flowing, its refineries are running, and it is saying absolutely nothing because anything China says draws attention to the fact that the sorting system is working and China is the primary beneficiary of the sorting system working. Now let me tell you about the North-South trade corridor because this is the piece that transforms the ship seizures from a military, political event into a civilizational economic event. Russia and Iran are simultaneously building what the Center for Strategic and International Studies, not an Iranian propaganda outlet, the most establishment American foreign policy institution there is, confirmed as a North-South trade route specifically designed to bypass Western sanctions entirely. The corridor runs from Russia's industrial base through the Caspian Sea through Iran to the Persian Gulf and Indian Ocean and onward. It connects Russian manufacturing and resource exports to South Asian markets, Central Asian economies, and ultimately to China's Belt and Road infrastructure from the other direction. That corridor requires Iran's operational control of the Persian Gulf's northern maritime access. Not theoretical control, not aspirational control, operational control. The kind of control you establish by seizing Western ships in one news cycle and guaranteeing Russian transit in the same news cycle. Every ship Iran seizes is not just a diplomatic pressure point on a negotiation. negotiation. Every ship Iran seizes is infrastructure for the north-south corridor. It is Iran demonstrating that it can and will manage Hormuz access on Iranian terms. And every Russian tanker that transits on the guaranteed bilateral route is a test run of the corridor's operational viability. Russia is not just getting safe passage through a strait. Russia is getting the anchor point of a parallel world economy. And China is investing in that corridor from the eastern end, while Russia invests in it from the northern end, and Iran operates the maritime choke point in the middle. The MSC Francesca is not in Iranian custody because of its cargo. It is in Iranian custody because its seizure demonstrates that the old system's guarantees do not operate in this corridor. And demonstrating that the old system's guarantees do not operate here is the precondition for the new system's guarantees to become credible. Let me steelman the argument that I am overrating this, because the strongest counter-arguments deserve to be engaged honestly and completely. The steelman goes like this. Iran has been granting selective access throughout this conflict since March 26. Russia, China, India, Iraq, Pakistan have all been on the permitted list for weeks. The guarantee Arakchi gave Lavrov is a reaffirmation of an existing arrangement, not a new strategic commitment. And selective access during a conflict has historical precedent that does not necessarily produce permanent structural change. Nasser eventually allowed Israeli passage through Suez under specific conditions after the Camp David Accords. The 1941 Japan parallel overstates determinism. Countries under maximum pressure make temporary arrangements with friends that they revise once the pressure eases. The Steelman also argues that Russia's genuine interest is in ending this conflict, not in extending Iranian leverage permanently. Lavrov, in the same call, emphasized the necessity of maintaining the ceasefire and said Russia would help facilitate agreements between Iran and Gulf Arab states. If Hormuz reopens to everyone under a deal, Russia's bilateral safe passage guarantee becomes meaningless because everyone has safe passage. Russia is not investing in Iranian permanent sovereignty over Hormuz. Russia is investing in the facilitator role that gives it influence over the deal. And a deal that Russia facilitates is a deal where Russia has leverage over both Iran and America simultaneously. The Steelman goes further on the economic argument. Alonso in the same call emphasized the essential of maintaining the ceasefire of help take still agreements with Iran and Gulf Arab states. For revenues have created a country facing that level of economic damage needs Hormuz reopened for Western commercial traffic, because Western commercial traffic generates Iranian toll revenue that Russian bilateral guarantees do not replace. All of that is serious. The diplomatic faction within Iran is real. The economic pain is real. The North-South corridor's commercial viability remains genuinely uncertain. These are not weak arguments, but here is what the Steelman cannot account for. Arakchi's specific language was not "we will accommodate Russian vessels within our current operational framework pending final resolution of the conflict." Arakchi's specific language was "the passage of vessels belonging to other countries through the Strait of Hormuz is carried out in coordination with the competent Iranian authorities." That sentence does not contain the word temporary. It does not contain the phrase "during the current conflict." It does not say "pending a deal." It asserts a permanent institutional reality. Iran is the competent authority for Hormuz passage. Full stop. And that sentence was published by Russia's foreign ministry, making it a matter of diplomatic record rather than a private assurance. Private assurances can be walked back. Diplomatic record cannot be walked back without consequences for the bilateral relationship that produced it. Iran has placed on the record with Russia that it is the competent authority over Hormuz. That commitment constrains every subsequent negotiation. Any deal America eventually signs with Iran cannot be more open than what Iran has already committed to Russia without Iran publicly contradicting an existing bilateral diplomatic commitment. And Iran contradicting a commitment it made to Russia on the record is not something Iran can do without consequences in the bilateral relationship with Russia that Iran depends on for drone technology, missile components, and UN Security Council protection. The Steelman assumes the diplomatic track and the structural track are operating in parallel, and one will eventually supersede the other. What I am arguing is that they are not parallel. The structural track is locking in commitments that constrain what the diplomatic track can produce. And China, watching both tracks simultaneously, is not confused about which one is real. Now I want to talk about what this means for every country that is not America and not China and not Russia and not Iran. Because the something big that China is watching is not just about the four main actors. The something big is about what every non-aligned country in the world is learning from watching those four actors interact. Saudi Arabia hosts American military bases. Saudi Arabia has been one of America's most important Gulf partners for 50 years. Saudi Arabia has also been pressing Washington privately to abandon the blockade. Saudi Arabia is watching Russia get in one phone call what America has failed to extract in 55 days of war. And Saudi Arabia is asking the question that every country with American bases and American security guarantees is asking right now. What does American power actually deliver? India is watching this war from a position of deep and complicated energy dependence on the Gulf. India has been buying Russian crude at a discount since 2022. India has been carefully maintaining its own relationship with Iran while formally aligning with Western positions on Ukrainian sovereignty. India is on Iran's permitted list. India's tankers are transiting Hormuz. India is watching America's ships get seized and America's commercial partners get turned back and asking the same question Saudi Arabia is asking. The Gulf states that have maintained quiet relationships with Iran despite formal alignment with American positions are watching this and learning. The African countries that have been approached by Chinese infrastructure investment for a decade are watching this and learning. Southeast Asian economies that depend on Hormuz for their own energy supply are watching this and learning. What they are all learning is the same lesson. The country that built relationships with Iran before the maximum pressure moment arrived, that country's ships are transiting. The countries that relied on American guaranteed freedom of navigation are watching their ships get seized. That is a lesson about which relationships produce results. And lessons like that do not stay in the foreign ministries. They move through economic planning departments and infrastructure investment decisions and currency reserve management and port development agreements. The structural shift China is watching happen at Hormuz is going to produce derivative shifts in how every non-aligned country positions itself over the next decade. And China knows this, and China is saying nothing about it because China wants those derivative shifts to happen without American interference in the process. Here is what the asymmetry between Russia's one phone call and America's 5 days of war actually tells the world. Russia did not bomb anything to get Hormuz access. Russia did not deploy a carrier group. Russia did not impose sanctions or threaten secondary tariffs or issue ultimatums. Russia made a phone call, and in that phone call, Iran gave Russia what America has been unable to extract through 5 days of active military operations and blockade enforcement and diplomatic pressure. The asymmetry is not about the specific outcome. The asymmetry is about what it reveals regarding the relative utility of different kinds of power in the current international system. American power in the Gulf is predominantly coercive. It is the power to bomb, to blockade, to sanction, to threaten. Russian power in the Gulf is predominantly relational. It is the power to mediate, to facilitate, to connect, to provide diplomatic cover. Iranian power in the Gulf is increasingly structural. It is the power to control the physical infrastructure through which the global economy must pass. Chinese power in the Gulf is predominantly economic and positional. It is the power to be the buyer that Iran cannot afford to lose and to have built the alternative systems that make Iranian defiance of American coercive power economically survivable. All four of those power types are operating simultaneously in Hormuz right now. And the one that produced zero results in 5 days is the coercive type. And the one that produced a formal bilateral diplomatic guarantee in 48 hours is the relational type. And the one that is establishing permanent structural facts on the ground is the structural type. And the one that made all of it possible by ensuring Iran had an economic alternative to Western commercial integration is the economic and positional type. China built the economic and positional type of power over a decade. And China is watching the results of that investment manifest in real time. And China is saying nothing. Let me tell you what America cannot say publicly about the Russia-Hormuz guarantee without creating a problem it cannot solve. America cannot say the Russia guarantee is a serious strategic development that we intend to confront directly because that statement requires America to then confront it directly. And directly confronting the Russia-Hormuz guarantee means simultaneously pressuring Iran on its nuclear program and pressuring Russia on its Ukrainian war and confronting China on its economic support for Iran. All at the same time across all three bilateral relationships simultaneously. America cannot manage that three-front confrontation while also conducting a ceasefire negotiation with Iran through Omani intermediaries. So America will not say it. America will not name the Russia-Hormuz guarantee in a formal State Department statement. America will not address it at a CENTCOM briefing. America will not put it in a Truth Social post. America will treat it as a peripheral complication to the main negotiation. And China is reading that silence from Washington as precisely as Washington should be reading China's silence. America's silence about the Russia guarantee tells China that America has already calculated that it cannot confront the guarantee without destabilizing the negotiation it is trying to conduct. America's silence tells China that American coercive power has a specific limit and Iran is operating just inside that limit deliberately and skillfully. And a country that knows the exact location of American power's limit is a country that can keep building structural facts right up to that limit indefinitely. China is watching America locate its own limit in real time. And China is mapping that limit for its own future reference. Watch three things as this unfolds, because I want to give you the specific signals that will tell you whether what I am describing is happening or whether the steelman is correct and this resolves into a conventional deal. The first thing to watch is whether Russian flagged or Russian tankers actively transit Hormuz in the coming days on the openly declared coordinated route. Not through the dark fleet transfer system off the coast of Fujian, but openly with Iranian coordination on the published maritime route Iran has declared for permitted vessels. I'll watch the marine traffic data. An open Russian tanker transit under Iranian coordination is the operational proof of the guarantee. It is the moment the sorting system goes from diplomatic language to established maritime practice. And watch whether any Western naval vessel challenges that transit. Because if a Russian tanker transits on Iranian coordinated terms and American or allied naval assets do not stop it, America has operationally accepted Iranian coordination authority over Hormuz in the same moment its diplomats are publicly demanding Hormuz be free and open. That contradiction, if it happens, is the most important operational signal in this entire conflict. It means the old system's enforcement mechanism has already been effectively withdrawn even while the old system's rhetoric continues. The second thing to watch is whether the number of seized vessels increases or stabilizes. Iran has seized 2 ships If Iran seizes 2 more in the next 30 days while Russian and Chinese transits continue unimpeded, Iran is not using seizures as negotiating leverage in a deal. Iran is using seizures to calibrate and demonstrate the sorting system. Negotiating leverage gets released when concessions are offered. The sorting system demonstrations continue until the sort is complete. If seizures continue despite diplomatic engagement, the Steelman's deal theory is wrong. If seizures pause following specific concessions from Western parties, the Steelman's deal theory has evidence. Watch which of those 2 patterns emerges. It will tell you more than any diplomatic statement from any party. The third and most important thing to watch is any public development in the North-South trade corridor infrastructure over the next 45 days. CSS confirmed the corridor is being built. What is not yet public is the pace of construction and when it becomes commercially operational rather than strategically conceptual. Watch for any announcement from Russia, Iran, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, or India about logistics agreements, rail connection upgrades, port capacity investments, or financing arrangements along the North-South route. Each announcement is a step toward the moment when Iran's economic dependence on Hormuz revenue from Western commercial traffic is structurally reduced. And the moment Iran's economic dependence on Western Hormuz revenue is structurally reduced, Iran's incentive to reach a deal that reopens Hormuz fully and unconditionally is structurally reduced by the same amount. The corridor is the long game. The ship seizures are the short game, and China is invested in both simultaneously. Because China is the primary destination market for the south end of the North-South corridor, and China is the primary customer for the Iranian crude that transits Hormuz on the safe passage list. China wins the short game and the long game simultaneously, and China is saying nothing about either one. Let me close with the question China is not asking because China already has the answer. If Iran is sorting ships by political alignment in the world's most important maritime corridor and Russia is on the safe passage list and China is on the safe passage list and India is on the safe passage list and Western commercial ships are being seized, what is Iran sorting toward? The answer is not complicated once you accept the framework. Iran is sorting toward a world in which passage through the Strait of Hormuz is a privilege granted by Iranian sovereign authority in coordination with Iran's political partners, not a right guaranteed by American naval power under the legal framework of freedom of navigation. Iran is sorting toward a world in which the physical infrastructure of global commerce is governed by the political alignments of the 2020s, not the legal architecture of the 1940s. And that world, if Iran establishes it in practice, one seized ship at a time, one bilateral guarantee at a time, one coordination requirement at a time, is a world in which the structural foundation of American global power, the guarantee that the seas are open and that the dollar clears the trade that moves across those seas is no longer universal. It is conditional. And a conditional American maritime guarantee is not a guarantee at all. It is a preference. And preferences, unlike guarantees, can be negotiated around. China has been negotiating around American preferences for a decade. China built the dark fleet and the yuan payment system and the strategic reserve and the Baidu satellite network specifically so that when the American maritime guarantee became conditional rather than universal, China would already have the infrastructure to operate outside the condition. The 2 seized ships are not a warning to America. America already knows it has a problem. The 2 seized ships are proof of concept for every other country watching. The proof that the condition has already arrived. The proof that the system that comes after the American maritime guarantee is not theoretical. It is operational. It is sorting ships right now. And China's silence is the loudest possible confirmation that the proof of concept worked exactly as designed. Because the country that benefits most from the world understanding that the new system is operational has every reason to stay quiet while the world figures it out on its own. Push back on this if you see it differently. Read the MFA readout from the Lavrov-Araghchi call. Read Araghchi's exact language about competent Iranian authority. Read the CS report on the North-South corridor specifically where it talks about reshaping the dollar-dominated global trade system over the coming decades. That is CSS language. Read the CFR data on autocratic share of global GDP approaching 50%. And then watch the marine traffic data, watch the vessel movements, watch which ships are transiting and which ships are sitting in Iranian custody, and ask the question China is not asking. Because the answer to that question tells you not just what is happening at Hormuz right now, it tells you what the world is going to look like when the sorting is finished. And the sorting has already begun.